Hello, my friends. We're on day 15, I think, of our Advent devotions. This is Wednesday the 14th. We're in the Psalms, and I want to take a look today actually at two Psalms, just because there's a common theme between the two. When we think about the Old Testament, we think about, the Old Testament, it talks about God's people, the people of Israel. The descendants of Abraham, and those, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those who lived in a particular place for a particular time. And they were the ones through whom, and who were expecting the Messiah, the ones through whom God was going to send the Messiah. But was the Messiah just for that nation, just for that small group of people? Certainly the Israelites believed that the Messiah was going to come and take care of them and going to rule over their nation, and as time went on, to restore the fortunes of the nation, to defeat all of their enemies that were around them. Under David and Solomon, under those kings, the nation was quite prosperous, and as things went poorly after that, the expectation was that the Messiah, the new king, the anointed one, would restore all that. But if you read the Old Testament, it actually also talks about not just saving God's people Israel, not just saving those descendants of Abraham, but that all nations are going to be blessed through this coming one, through God's people and through the anointed one that's going to come. And that's where we get a couple of Psalms. Psalm 67 and Psalm 72. And there are others, but those are just the two that I picked for today. Talk about God's blessing coming not only to the people of Israel, but through them to all nations. Psalm 67, for the first two verses: "May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine upon us," an echo of the benediction that we often use that was first given to Aaron. Verse 2, "So that your ways may be known on earth, your salvation among all nations." This psalm invokes God's blessing on the people Israel, on that nation, but not just so that they could be above everybody else or be taken care of instead of everybody else, but so that all nations can be blessed through them. Indeed, that's what happens. God's Messiah, anointed one, Jesus, comes to the people of Israel, to that nation, but not simply to save one small, distinct nation, but to work through that nation to bless all people. Which comes up again in Psalm 72, a royal psalm, one that we think Solomon wrote. And it talks about how it's a prayer that God would verse 1, "Endow your king with justice, your royal son with righteousness. He will judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones in justice." Solomon praying for himself, obviously, but a prayer not just for Solomon, but for all the kings that followed, and ultimately for Christ. And you start reading through this, and again, it's a prayer for that the king rule, and not just over this one small piece of dirt. Verse 5, "He will endure as long as the sun, as long as the moon, through all generations." Go down to verse 8. "He will rule from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth." This is a prayer that God's king, as Solomon is praying for himself, frankly, would rule not just over one nation, one people, but that through this king, all nations are going to come under God's gracious care. Through this king, all nations are going to be blessed. All nations will be gathered, and all nations will come to worship. You go on through Psalm 72, and there are more verses that talk about other kings of other nations bringing tribute to God's king. And again, we see this first as a prayer of Solomon, asking that God would bless him in his reign, but also then ultimately fulfilled in Christ, as Christ is the king, following the line of David, and how he now rules over all creation, over all nations, as all people are gathered into his church. So, look for those themes as you read through the Psalms, how it talks about God's blessing coming to many more people than simply one small nation, just the one people of Israel. God's intent is to save all people. We'll talk more tomorrow. God be with you.